In this lecture, you are going to learn about the organisation of the nervous system, the structure of the nerve cell or neuron, and also the structure of the spinal cord. At the end of this lecture, you should have a very good understanding of the structure of the nerve cell or nerve fibre. You should know the anatomical and functional divisions of the nervous system. And finally, you should be able to describe the histological structure of the spinal cord and also be able to identify its functional components. Well, the nervous system is really important, and its essential function, as you would all be aware of, is one of communication. And through the next two lectures, I will be explaining to you structural and functional components that allow us to perceive various information, both consciously and subconsciously, and how the brain then receives that information and then evokes responses, either motor responses bringing about movement or responses that we are unaware of that control many of our body processes, secretion of glands, movement of food through the gut, blood through the vascular system, etc. Well, it's very important that we first of all start with a description of the divisions of the nervous system. And although this is very complex, I'm going to try and take it slowly and try and explain it in a number of different sections. First of all, we can divide the nervous system anatomically. It consists of two parts. One is the central nervous system, we abbreviate CNS, and that consists of the brain and the spinal cord. The brain is protected inside the cranium, the skull, and the spinal cord is protected by the vertebral column. The peripheral nervous system, abbreviated PNS, consists of cranial nerves, spinal nerves, and peripheral nerves. There are 12 cranial nerves, and they leave the brain or brainstem to supply structures mainly in the head. Now, although I said there are 12 cranial nerves, the first two are really nerve tracts rather than nerves. And we will describe those as we look at the structure of the nasal cavity and the sense of smell, and also vision in a later lecture. Spinal nerves are named according to the segments in which they exit the spinal column. For instance, C1, C2, C3, or T1, T2 from the thoracic region. And those spinal nerves can then combine together and form a number of plexuses. For instance, the brachial plexus in the neck region that provides nerves supplying the upper limb, or the lumbosacral plexus in the lumbar region, providing nerves that supply muscles in our lower limb. And then some of those peripheral nerves can be named. The sciatic nerve, for instance, in our lower limb, or the median, ulnar and radial nerve in our upper limb. Besides nerves, the peripheral nervous system consists of structures we call ganglia. They're structures that house the nerve cell bodies of sensory neurons, those neurons that pick up sensations in the periphery, and those ganglia also house nerve cell bodies to do with the autonomic nervous system. And I'll describe the autonomic nervous system later on in this lecture. As well as having nerves and having locations for cell bodies in ganglia in the peripheral nervous system, of course, we also have the nerve endings, the motor end plates that transmit the nerve impulse onto skeletal muscles or smooth muscles through the motor end plates of skeletal muscles, or the myoneural junctions, they're often called. And then there are all the sensory nerve endings in all the sensory receptors we have perhaps in the skin that carry all the information about touch, pain, pressure, etc., back into the central nervous system So we're aware of those sensations and we can deal with them by various means. Besides the anatomical divisions of the nervous system, there are also functional divisions: the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system consists of that part of the nervous system that we are consciously aware of, such as the movement of our body, the movement and contraction of skeletal muscle in our limbs, and sensory information such as temperature, touch, and pain. All that sort of information that we're aware of, muscle movement and sensory perception. The autonomic nervous system is that part of the nervous system that controls parts of our body that we are unaware of. And it includes nerves that provide stimulus to smooth muscle cells, and also cardiac muscle fibres, and also the secretion of glands. And those nerve fibres, those subconscious nerve fibres, are of two sorts. They're either parasympathetic fibres or they're sympathetic fibres. So they form part of the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. And usually, those two divisions are antagonists. They do the opposite effects on their target tissues. They might increase the rate of the heartbeat, or they might decrease the rate of the heartbeat. They might increase contraction of smooth muscle, moving food along the gut, or decrease it. There are also sensory neurons that travel from viscera. By viscera, I refer to the internal organs of the body. We are unaware of that sort of sensory information going to our central nervous system and being interpreted. The sort of movement of food through the gut, for instance, the contraction of smooth muscle, changing the dimensions of all our blood vessels to affect the flow of blood to different parts of our organs when they're required. We are unaware of those sorts of controls. That's all part of the autonomic nervous system. Now finally, the enteric division is a totally different system. It's separate from both the somatic nervous system and also the autonomic nervous system. It refers to a group of neurons or a network of neurons or nerve cells that we see along the gut tube. And those neurons control the activity of the muscle layers of the gut, and they work independently of the central nervous system. I'm not going to refer to those neurons or that division in this lecture, but I'll refer to these neurons and this network of nerve fibres when I talk about the gut. So let's first of all look at what the major components of nerve tissue is. On this slide, you can see two images. Both these images contain the two major components of nerve tissue. One is the neuron, or the nerve fibre. It's often called a nerve fibre because the processes, the axonal processes we'll see later on, are very, very long. So when I use the term neuron, or nerve fibre, or in fact nerve cell, I'm referring to the same structure. As well as having neurons, throughout the nervous tissue there are supporting cells called glial cells. And there are a number of different sorts of glial cells, and I'll describe these sorts of cells both in this lecture and in the next lecture. I want you to look at the right-hand side picture, the one showing the glial cell, and I want you to try and remember this picture because I'm going to ask you to hold it in your memory because I'm going to refer back to this glial cell in the next lecture when we talk about glial cells in the brain. Have a very careful look at this image and notice that this glial cell has some very, very fine little black fibres or processes moving through the neural tissue. This elongated structure, it's a bit hard to see because of the stain used, is a blood capillary. And blood capillaries are lined by very thin squamous cells. Thin squamous cells because it's the best sort of design of an epithelial surface or the lining of a blood capillary to allow very effective transport of nutrients such as glucose and oxygen into the neural tissue. Now, when I described certain epithelia, I said that squamous cells, particularly those lining blood capillaries in the brain, are very tightly bound together. They prevent lots of materials, particularly pathogens and even drugs, from entering into the nerve tissue. And it's not just because of the structural integrity of the endothelial cell, the squamous cell lining the blood capillary, but it's also due to other components that help that capillary be very, very impermeable. And one of those components is this glial cell that I want you to remember and recall in my next lecture. Well, when we look at a nerve fibre in more detail, we can see that there are other structures that we need to describe and recognise. Here is a section of, again, some neurons found in the brain region. The left-hand image, you can see long, elongated structures. And on the right-hand side, you can see a very high magnification of another neuron. So I will describe each of these. They're motor neurons. Motor neurons are those that bring about movement of skeletal muscle in the somatic division of the nervous system, or they bring about movement of smooth muscle in the autonomic division of the nervous system. On the left-hand side, the brown stained neurons you see are called pyramidal cells. They consist of a cell body. We call the cell body a soma when we refer to the cell body of a neuron. And if we have a look at this cell body in high magnification, as we can see on the right-hand image, we see details of the cell body in more a recognisable position, a more stained illustration than you see on the left-hand side, and it's also a higher magnification. Now, this ventral horn cell that you see labelled on the right-hand side has got lots and lots of dark stained material in the cell body, in the soma. It's called Nissl substance. And that reflects all the granular or rough endoplasmic reticulum inside the cell body, the soma. Because neurons are not just like electrical cables and transmit nerve impulses. They manufacture lots of substances, lots of proteins and lots of other structures. And here is an example where this cell, the ventral horn cell, which I'll describe in more detail in a moment, is making a lot of protein. Some of that is going to be the neurotransmitter substances that enable the impulse to transfer from one neuron across to another at a synapse, or from the motor end plate to the muscle. So they're very busy cells manufacturing those sorts of components. And the axon extends a very long way into other parts of the body. But before the axon carries an impulse down through the nerve fibre, a lot of information is received by the cell body, through a dendritic branch, a whole lot of little branches from the cell body called dendrites. And then the transmission goes down the long process you see labelled as the axon. Now, those axons are extremely long in some cases. These two cells communicate with each other. The pyramidal cell is located in the cortex of the cerebrum, in the motor cortex. So you're looking really here on the left-hand side of an image of the cortex, the cerebral cortex of the brain, the motor cortex. And those pyramidal cells, those axons you see labelled, project all the way down the spinal cord from the cerebral cortex. So they can be extremely long. They can go all the way down to the lumbar or sacral part of our spinal cord. And there, they communicate with these ventral horn cells you see on the right-hand side. Those ventral horn cells sit in what we will term later on and describe later on as the ventral horn of the spinal cord. And these pyramidal cells then stimulate these ventral horn cells to then innervate skeletal muscles. And therefore those neuron processes are also very long. They can extend from the spinal cord all the way down to our toes. So these axons are extremely long, and these axons from these ventral horn cells will form part of what we call a peripheral nerve. Now, I mentioned earlier that these cells are busy making neurotransmitter substance. So within these long processes, these long axons, there are certain components that allow the transport of these neurotransmitter substances and other substances down the length of the axon. Sometimes slow transport, sometimes very fast transport. And those structures are the microtubules you'll see inside axons if you looked at them under electron microscope. Lots and lots of microtubules. They're like a railway line, a railway track that carries packages of neurotransmitter substances all the way down to the axon terminals. It's a very important function of nerve cells to have that transport mechanism. And the transport of the cell body down towards the axonal processes at the end plates or the synapses, is called anterograde flow. Now things can also flow backwards from the end terminals of the axons all the way back to the cell body. That's called retrograde flow. And in fact, that's how the early neurobiologists traced where different cell bodies were located that controlled different parts of the body. They injected dyes, etc., into, say, peripheral muscles or peripheral regions of the body, and those dyes were taken up by the axon terminals, and through this retrograde flow, those dyes or whatever markers these early neurobiologists use was taken back up into the brain, into the somas of the nerve cell bodies. And there, the neurobiologist was able to identify where these cell bodies were located and therefore map out parts of the brain and regions of the brain that control various parts of the body. Now, there's also a bad story about that as well, because some viruses can therefore get into the end terminals of nerve fibres and travel into the central nervous system. Sometimes the rabies virus, resulting from the bite from a dog, for instance, can replicate in skeletal muscle over a period of 2 to 10 or 12 weeks, and then finally find its way into the axon terminals and move all the way up into the central nervous system. And there the virus can move throughout the central nervous system and even travel down other axons by anterograde flow to other parts of the body and cause all sorts of problems. So now that you know a little bit about the basic structural components of neurons, let's have a look and see now how we can further subdivide these neurons into 3 different types. In the previous slide, we looked, of course, at the motor neuron. It was a somatic neuron that supplied skeletal muscles, that brought about the contraction of skeletal muscle. It's voluntary, we're aware of it. Now, the other type of motor neuron is the visceral neuron that innervates smooth muscle, as well as components of the heart that increase the rate of impulse travelling or impulse conduction by specialised cardiac muscles called Purkinje fibres that brings about an increase or maybe a decrease in the heartbeat. And these visceral neurons can also innervate glands and increase secretion rate or decrease it, whatever the case may be. Now, I've also got the term efferent neuron there to describe both the somatic neurons and also the visceral neurons. Efferent means exiting the brain and spinal cord. Think of E for efferent, E for exiting. And it's the way I remember that all efferent neurons are motor neurons. The next type of neuron is the sensory neuron. And again, we have somatic components and visceral components. The somatic sensory neurons are from the periphery, and they give us information about touch and temperature, pain and pressure, and various other sensations that we are aware of. We also are sometimes aware of certain aches and sensations in internal organs or in mucous membranes. And that sort of sensory information comes in through viscerant afferent neurons. Visceral means from the internal parts of the body. Now I use the word afferent then, an afferent neuron, to describe a sensory neuron. Think of the word afferent, the letter A for arriving. The impulses are arriving into the brain or spinal cord with information, sensory information. Now, besides having motor neurons and sensory neurons, there are interneurons. They're much smaller. Sometimes they're called intercalated neurons or even integrative neurons. But their job is really just to communicate between both sensory and motor neurons, and also between various other neurons that we find in the spinal cord and the brain. So they create integrating networks so that the information is brought into the brain or spinal cord, it's then transferred to other neurons for processing by these particular interneurons. Now, here's a diagram to actually describe what the structure of some of these neurons look like. And I just want you really to concentrate on the two diagrams on the right-hand side of this particular picture. The first one is a motor neuron. Notice it's got a dendritic tree or dendrite branch around the cell body or soma. Those dendrites, remember, receive information from other neurons, other interneurons, where the information is then processed by the cell. And then the impulse is fired and travels down the long axon you see labelled there as well. Only one axon travelling down from the motor neuron. It's called a motor neuron or a multipolar neuron. Now, on the next section, you see a sensory neuron on the next diagram. Notice its cell body sits out on its own and it actually has two processes. Two long axons extend, one to the periphery and one into the central nervous system or the brain. That's because this is a sensory neuron and one part of the axon is bringing information in from the periphery, and then the other part of the axon travels past the cell body and brings information into the brain or spinal cord. Now we're going to see later on that cell body you can see of the sensory neuron is actually located outside the brain and spinal cord in a sensory ganglion. Remember, I mentioned at the very start of this lecture that a ganglion is a collection of cell bodies outside the central nervous system. Well, this is an example of where one of these sensory neuron cell bodies is located. It's often called a pseudo-unipolar or a unipolar neuron, sensory neuron, because it's only got one little process, one little pole coming from the cell body, whereas the motor one has a number of different processes coming, such as the dendrites, all the dendrites, and also the one long process, the axon. We'll talk about the bipolar or retinal neurons when we look at the eye in a later lecture. Well, here's another diagram showing you some enormous communicating neurons. They have enormous dendritic trees. Have a look at the Purkinje cell that we're going to see in the next lecture in the cerebellum. It has an enormous array of dendritic branches. So too there's a pyramidal cell in the hippocampus. And that's because these two neurons are getting an enormous amount of information to process before they then fire off their axons to control or at least influence some body function, some activity via other nerves. Integrative neuron is another term used for these neurons that I mentioned before. High, massive branches of dendritic trees that perceive and receive information. So in summary, just have a look at this little diagram and make sure, more importantly for this lecture, that you know structurally the difference between the motor neuron and the sensory neuron. Because what we're going to do now is we're going to actually see where these cell bodies are located within the central nervous system and spinal cord and within the ganglia just outside the spinal cord. Before we do so, it's important to now understand that the neurons communicate with each other through synapses, junctions. And if you look at the image shown here, this is on the bottom right-hand side of this screen. You can see a large soma or large cell body of a neuron, and you can see a synapse occurring. A synapse is a process from another axon coming into contact with another neuron, as you see here. And they're called different names depending on whereabouts the axon comes in contact with the next neuron. In case of the one labelled, the axon is in contact with the soma or the cell body, so it's called an axosomatic synapse, whereas others might have a contact on the dendritic branches of the cell or on the axonal branch of the neuron. So in that case, it's called axodendritic or axonic. I'm not going to go through the details of the structure of the synapse, but basically you have a presynaptic and a postsynaptic membrane and a synaptic cleft or a gap across which the neurotransmitter substance from one axon is going to transport across and depolarize the cell membrane of the next neuron, and therefore the impulse will travel forward. Well, I mentioned earlier that we are going to look at the location of both motor neurons and also sensory neurons in the spinal cord. So let's move on and try and understand now the structure of the spinal cord. Here is a section on the left-hand side taken through the spinal cord. And immediately you see that there are two different stain components. One, called the grey matter, is shaped a bit like the H, the letter H, or it's a bit like a butterfly. On the outside of that butterfly, there is a darker stain, a darker blue stain component we call the white matter. So the spinal cord consists of two major components, grey matter and white matter. And it's important to understand the difference between the two. Now, it seems a bit silly saying they're grey and white matter when in fact they're blue in this section. But that basis, that naming, is because if you section through a spinal cord in fresh tissue, then it appears white and grey, because the grey part, the butterfly shape within the spinal cord, is where all the cell bodies are located of neurons, interneurons, and also the ventral, horn or motor neurons. Remember, the sensory neuron cell bodies are not located in the spinal cord. And the reason why it looks grey relative to the outer white region is because the white matter consists of all the axonal processes and some dendritic branches as well. And those axons are myelinated. They're surrounded by fatty tissue, myelin, that I'll talk about later on. So it looks white, fatty white material compared to the less myelinated region in the centre of the spinal cord, the butterfly. So that's where it gets its name, white matter and grey matter. And of course, if you stain the spinal cord, as we'll see in subsequent slides, you'll see that this white and grey matter is often blue, brown, depending on the stain used. But the first thing you should understand now is that the internal butterfly shape is the grey matter and the outside area is called the white matter. If you look very, very carefully down in the bottom of the section where I've labelled the ventral horn, this is where the somatic motor neurons live. If you look very carefully at this low magnification picture, you may be able to see some little bluey spots. They're the ventral horn cells, the motor neurons you see on the right-hand section in higher magnification. Again, they have a rather pale nucleus with a prominent nucleolus, which was labelled in the previous description a few slides back. And look also at the appearance of the soma. Remember that dark clumped stain material is Nissl substance. Well, you can see the term there, dorsal horn and ventral horn. They refer to the wings of the butterfly, if you like. Dorsal means the posterior part of the spinal cord. Ventral is the anterior or front part of the spinal cord. And they house two different components, two different sorts of neurons. And it's very important for you to understand what neurons are housed in these different areas. The dorsal horn is where the fibres, the axons from sensory neurons enter into the spinal cord. Their cell body is located at some distance away in ganglia. But when those axons receive information from the periphery and it travels all the way up into the ganglion cell, it's then transported and enters the spinal cord through this dorsal horn. Whereas the ventral horn houses cell bodies of motor neurons, somatic motor neurons, those that are going to innervate skeletal muscles, those that we're consciously aware of. And it's very important you know the difference then of the dorsal horn and the ventral horn and the sorts of neurons that you find there. Of course, if you look under very high power there, you'll see cell bodies of other neurons in both those regions, and they, of course, will be the intercalated or interneurons that we described earlier. Well, if you look at some parts of the spinal cord as well, you can just make out a very small lateral horn. The lateral horn is a part of the spinal cord, a part of the grey matter that houses the cell bodies of the visceral motor neurons, those ones that are going to innervate smooth muscle, those that are going to innervate components in the body that we're not really aware of. These visceral motor neurons are part of the autonomic nervous system, and I'll refer again to them later on. They're housed in the lateral horn. So just have a look at this image on the left-hand side. Look where the lateral horn is located, and just test yourself whether you've remembered what sort of neurons are associated with the dorsal horn and what sort of neurons are associated with the ventral horn. As I said, it's very, very important that we remember that because it's going to be very important later on. And on the right-hand side, you can see again a very higher magnification picture of one of these visceral motor neurons. They're not as big as the large ventral horn cells we saw earlier. And just to the right of that cell, you can see some little dark stained blue areas. They're the axons, they're the myelinated axons of the white matter. And we'll describe that in more detail later on. Now, just imagine that this butterfly or this area of grey matter is travelling all the way up and down the spinal cord, as is the white matter. You're only looking at a single section or two in this image, a very thin section through the spinal cord. But as I said, imagine this area of grey matter moving or being present all the way up and down the spinal cord. So you can then imagine the enormous numbers of ventral horn cells there may be, and the enormous numbers of sensory neurons coming into the dorsal horn, all the way along the spinal cord. Very fascinating concept. Of course, you can see that the grey matter is different in both these images. And that's because the grey matter in the image on the left-hand side is probably only housing motor neurons that might innervate muscles of the torso. So this is a section probably through the thoracic region of the spinal cord. Muscles of the torso are less in number than the muscles that we have that move our upper limb or our lower limb. And therefore we have the need for a lot more of these ventral horn cells in the region of the spinal cord where these ventral horn cells are going to exit and form peripheral nerves. So that's why you see the difference in the size of the grey matter as you move up and down the spinal cord. It's also pretty easy to understand or to identify what is the ventral horn and what is the dorsal horn, because the ventral horn, as you see on the right-hand side, is generally a lot larger, a lot more elongated as well than the dorsal horn. So in summary, you should understand the structure of the nerve cell. Remember, the cell body is called the soma. Lots of rough endoplasmic reticulum inside the cell is referred to as nissl substance. And the main processes of the nerve cell is the long axon, the dendritic branches that receive information, and that axons can be myelinated or unmyelinated. And also, between the myelin sheaths in a myelin axon is a node of Ranvier, which enhances the transmission of the impulse along the axon. You should also understand the divisions of the nervous system, both anatomically and functionally. And finally, you should know the structure of the spinal cord and the different functional components that are within that spinal cord, because that's going to be the subject of a later lecture. So thank you very much for listening to this lecture. I hope you've enjoyed learning about the neuron, the structure of the spinal cord, and the general organisation of the nervous system.